years ago in Nunavut. 12 people died when the Boeing 737 crashed into a hill near
This is a bearing separator. I put it on upside down so that the beveled sides are on the bottom, the flat sides on top. I heat this up so it expands the metal a little bit, making it easier to pop off. I already pre-warmed it. And I adjusted these two nuts to get this level, because when you put this in upside down, these bolts that go through here have a sloppy clearance, so that this thing flexes a little bit, so I got to even it out. And then you just start cranking on this thing, and usually it breaks with a crack. This one didn't pop with a crack. It's pretty quiet. It's coming off pretty easy.
In Pretoria, the prosecution has closed its case against Oscar Pistorius. The WPT runner is accused of murdering his girl.
There's a C-clip.
Society says children know their gender.
Needs to be removed off of here so we can get this gear off. I use this type of a tool. Use a screwdriver, a small screwdriver. When I separate it, lift up the back side and very carefully slide it up so I don't over distort the thing. Otherwise it won't fit on there real tight next time. So now we got to get that gear off.
Check out our website.
Got the bearing separator on so that the dish side is, the flat side's on the bottom. Pull the fifth gear off. It's coming real easy. Just like nothing. Didn't even have to heat it up. I ran out of thread, so I'm just kind of tap it. It'll come off. There's a snap ring on holding the bearing in place. Get that off next. Alright, I'm using a screwdriver to lift the back side. Now it looks like the snap ring is only popping out on one side of the shaft. This side of the shaft is a little tight, so take a center punch and just kind of tap the bearing down just a touch. Maybe it'll free that up, yeah. But not enough. Troublesome bearing. Gonna knock it on a little further, get some clearance for that C-clip. So they come off of there, just hanging up. It's all too tight. Still can't get it.
That's full circle, and they've had an amazing transit over the last relatively short time, just a couple of years, maybe 3 years at the very outside, since they were quite obscure and have really well emerged in Canadian towns with a career on the way. So, how did that happen?
Yeah, you gotta put this bearing puller on there. There's the dish side, which is this side, which is made for separating bearings. It actually goes underneath the bearing, and these angles here, just you squeeze it in, it lifts the bearing up enough, and then once you get it up, then you can get some more stuff on it to pull it off. But in order to get this bearing off, I got to turn it upside down so I have the flat side underneath the bearing, because there's not much grip there for the bearing. There's just a little bit of grip. Just barely gonna get it. Put these on. I kind of want to make it so it's kind of level. When the tension goes up, I want to make sure that shaft is vertical as possible. So you might have to loosen and tighten these until it's about right. And then when you start cranking down on it, kind of keep an eye out, make sure it's not tilting a little too much to one side. That looks pretty level, so I'm going to go ahead and put some more oomph into it. There, the bearing's starting to move. On want to make sure it's coming straight up. Eyeball it, still looks really level, so I think I'm going to be all right. Take her all the way up. That gets us, that's the output shaft front bearing. Really not in that bad a shape. We're going to be replacing it. Now we got to get this one off. You do pretty much the same thing. Slip that over it. Ups with the flat side on top on the bearing separator. Get it underneath there, take the nuts down. Make sure it's level. I think I need to. That's pretty good. Now if I want to make it come off easier, I would heat this up with the torch just a little bit, but I don't think I'm going to need to on this one. It's just coming right off. That's the bearing surface. Goes on top of this type of bearing. Try to keep them in the same location. Now this is 4th gear, and I can slip my finger underneath the Syncro. There's a couple of bearings underneath there. And I'm going to take it off, flip it over, and set it down. Now when I pull the bearings off, they're split bearings, so I can take them off of there. And then flip them over, and drop them inside so they're in the same location. I should just show you. I'm dropping them back inside there so they're in the same position they were. Now I have to get this snap ring off right here. I use a needle nose. I put one on each side of the C-clip. Put this on the back side so I can catch the C-clip. And just hit both ends of the handle. That knocks that thing right off of there. At least get the thickness, because the thicknesses vary. This is a 1.1 thickness. That way I can make sure I get the right one back in the same location. Inside, there's a spacer. And the thickness on that is 0.0788, looks like, approximately. And then there's another bearing, what they call a thrust bearing. I'm going to set it in my tray so that the top is up, so it goes back in the same way. Now we have to remove this hub, which is going to take a little bit of messing around, but I can pop this off. But I just have to be careful because there's detents in here and they're going to fall out. They're spring loaded. So when I pop it off, I want to kind of keep everything. There goes one. That's your reverse, and it controls 3rd and 4th gear. It's called the clutch hub slider. I call them a slider. And then what popped out of there is what they call detents. There's 3 of them. Shift keys is another name for them. There's one down on the ground there somewhere, but I'll find it. And then inside here on each side there's a spring. Pull it out with a magnet. 3 springs. Notice how these are copper shields. So I can put this in here and safely tighten it down without having to worry about damaging the shaft while I'm working on it. And we got to get this snap ring off here, which is going to take this tool. Don't want to expand it any more than I have to, just enough to get it off so it maintains its shape. If it gets sprung, we'll take well, it's a little sprung, it's a little odd around. We'll take a pair of channel lock pliers and we'll squeeze it back into shape before it's installed. And like I say, I always like to measure the thickness. That one's .095. You clean these off, make sure it's nice and clean. Check it again here. Yeah, it's actually 091. .091. Now this is first gear. Something you got to watch out for if you're working on more than one type of transmission for these Tercels. The early models from 83 to 85 or so, the gear is a different diameter, has a different number of teeth for first gear. Second, third, and fourth, and fifth are all the same, so they're interchangeable between the ears. But you got to be careful of the first gear. And there's some bearings underneath there, needle bearings. Keep those in there so they don't fall out. And take it all off as one assembly. Try to keep it together. There's a little bearing right here. That's a .19 diameter bearing. Gotta keep an eye out for that because it'll fall out and get lost. Now this is another clutch hub here, slider. There's a little bit of a bevel on this side, so the bevel is aft and the flat side is on the bottom. But when I pop that off there, keep my hand around it so when the shift keys come out of there, they don't go flying. Well, it looks like I'm not going to be able to get it off without kind of sort of taking it apart, so take this out. That's the shift key spring. There we go. The shift key says, it looks like 51 on the back side. Slider. The little bit of a bevel goes aft. Three shift keys. It's number 51. Now to get this one off, it's going to be a little bit of a messing around. When you wiggle these gears back and forth, I'm pushing this. This is third gear. I'm pushing it back and forth this way and this way. And when I put a feeler gauge in there, it's got over the limit. .011 is the max when you slip a feeler gauge in there, and we're getting like .015, so I'm gonna have to do something about that. Second gear, moving back and forth. I already measured it, and it's within tolerance at .008, .009. But we still have to take it apart because we're going to replace the Syncro. Okay, I had to use these long extensions, like 12.5-inch long all thread. Put it behind the second gear with the bearing separator, the flat side against the gear, and start tightening this down. And you see that hub is moving out pretty easily. I didn't even have to heat it up. It's going out pretty easy. See the hub? Synchro, second gear. Hub has a spring in the back side of it to hold the detents out. And the protrusion side of the hub goes forward. The bigger protrusion. There's a small protrusion on this side. And now we're going to reverse everything and pull that side off. Okay, I've turned this around so I can pull the hub for fourth and third gear off. This is third gear. But this one's always been a little tighter, so I'm going to just heat up the hub a little bit till it's kind of like fingertip hot. Okay, I warmed it up till it's a little warm. Hopefully it expanded enough. Slowly tighten this up. There, it broke free. It gives us the hub that controls third and fourth gear. Protrusion is bigger and everything is kind of offset forward, and you have the Syncro ring, which, by the way, it's got a pretty good gap. It looks pretty good. And then you see how I had this on with the flat side against the gear. Okay, the thickness of this thing comes in at about 0.168. The best one that I have here is 0.171. I'm not really sure what it all means. I have these different output shafts. I wrote down all the different numbers for the distances. The first number is the distance from the end of the shaft to this edge of the groove. And then the second measurement is the width of the groove. The third measurement is the distance from this edge here to the end. The fourth one is the distance from here to the end. You can see on this shaft here is a significant difference. You've got 0.143 on the first one, 0.178 on this one, and then 143, 145, 143, 143. Not really sure what it all means, but there is a difference somewhat between. I know in the manual it tells you you're supposed to measure the width of this, and I measured all these and they're all pretty close to the same. They're within the tolerance of the factory service manual. These two are off of a two-wheel drive. I also measured the overall width from here to the far side, thickness of third gear, and they vary from 1.224 to 1.23. Not really sure how significant that is, except that I can't find any adjustment. This is where the gear sits. Right here on the shaft, rests up against that, and that's where I have a little bit of thrust clearance. It's a little too much on this one for Petros's transmission. Also wanted to note that this shaft had also a thinner, this is like a 0.78 thick, but this one had a .045 thick ring for this thrust washer, and the width of this being a lot bigger, there was a bigger snap C in there, snap clip, than the other ones have. Okay, this is the hub, number 2 hub. I measured the thickness, and these are the numbers I got. The first one being Peters. And that was the best one right there. I think I'll use that on Peters. Third one is pretty good too. It came out of the 2-wheel drive I got from DeWato Charlie. Again, that's the measuring that distance inside there from that protrusion face to that face. And that's for the hub between 3rd and 4th gear. Well, it's kind of hard to see, but the wear marks on this is off of Peters, Petros or Petros or whatever you call them on the website. And then you compare it to the wear marks on this one, which was the best one I had. I don't know if you can tell much, but I can still see the machining marks on that one. And I think this is the best one I had. It's got very uniform wear pattern. I can't see the machine marks so much, but it's such a uniform pattern compared to say that one where you can see shiny spots, and looks like it definitely had some wear on it. There's one that you can see a difference between the shiny and the dark. And that one has machine marks are gone. But oh, that one just looks like a really good one. Very uniform. Even though I can't see the machine marks. That was the second best one. You can see the machine marks. Anyway, the thickness on that one is .591. And this one, which I thought was my best one, came out at .5, about, it's a hair over .591, like .5912. It's a slight difference, but that's the one I'm going to use. This is my homemade rig here. Press that hub on. Save old bearing parts and pipes. Cut the pipe so it's as square as possible. Little piece of pipe down there. Jack it down with a little jack. I had to drill a hole in the top of my workbench to get the shaft down through there. Okay, I put the 3rd gear on, new Syncro, and I'm using a different shaft. This is a little thicker here. And I pressed it on, and I got the clearance now to .008 instead of like .015. Next goes on is thrust bearing. I'll put a little oil on it before I drop it on there.
He's the world's leading tenor and the pride of
Okay. Next parts that go on are these needle bearing. They come in halves. And then the thrust washer drops down over the top. And then you have the Syncro in 4th gear, which drop down over the bearing.
the overture from Mozart's abduction from the Tercel.
I just dropped fourth gear on. Next thing to go on would be the C snap. And at this point you have to remember that before you can put the bearing and everything on here, you have to put the slider that goes over this with the Syncro detents and springs in it. If you forget to do that, then you got to pull the bearing back off. Did that once. Next part that goes on is the C clip. It's a point. This one's a 0.109 thick. Go right in there. Press that on. I usually use a pair of channel lock pliers and very carefully press it on the back side. I put a little bit of tissue to protect it. Works pretty good. That's the setup I use. Channel lock pliers, tissue on the back side to protect. Just squeeze it on. This is a smaller of the two thrust washers. Sits right there. This piece goes on next. Very carefully we'll press it on there. Or just, if I heat it up first and then I can tap it down, that's what I've done before. I might try that. But you either have to press it on or heat it up and carefully tap it. And when you tap it, go all the way around. Try to keep it as even as possible. You can put this on first because this will slide over it, and that'll have to be done at the next step before I put the bearing on. Okay, when tapping this down, you make sure this bearing doesn't get pinched. In the factory service manual, they recommend that you grease it in so it stays attached to this as you press it on. That way it keeps centered. But I'm just going to be very careful and tap it down after I heat this up. And keep checking this because it'll vibrate out of position. Make sure it's centered and get it on there right. Alright, so I heated that up so it was just a little too hot to pick up. I picked it up real quickly, set it on there. Started tapping it and it slid right down, and I tapped it until it was solid, run evenly all the way around. You hear that? There's a little bit of play, but funny, the tolerance for this is like 0.09, and this is right now is like 0.01, so it's well within tolerance at that point. Okay, now we're at the point where I need to put the springs in. Put the two holes on top so I can drop those springs, and the bottom one I'll grease so it'll stay in there. This is the detent or shift key. Sits right in there. And make sure that the Syncro slots, I'll put just a little grease on it, kind of keep it there. And turn it till the Syncro slots line up. And it can go down. And grease up the other side and put the bottom. What I'm going to do is wrap my hand around and get my finger on all three of those detent springs and push on them while I slide this gear over them. It's kind of tricky. Okay, before I can slide this over, look inside there. You have to line up that one where there's a missing slot on, or groove on each side of it. See, like that one right there. That has to line up on the shift key or it won't go on. So I'm going to mark the tooth on the top side with some blue stuff so I know that when I'm sliding it on I've got it lined up right. And you can see I've got that mark. So So when I slip that on there, I can line up the shift key on that mark. Okay, after a bit of wrestling, I got it on there. Okay, so I wiggle the Syncro back and forth. That's the brass colored one. Stops because its Synchros are stopping it from moving. Same with this side. You can wiggle the Syncro back and forth and it stops. Here you can see I very carefully slid this over. You don't want to slide it any further until it's flush. Otherwise these detents will pop out and you got to fight to get them back in. But I slid it over just enough so that I can push down on the shift keys and make sure the springs are in there all the way around if I feel a little tension on them. If there's no tension, then you know your spring fell out while you were trying to install it. I'm pretty sure I have this done correctly. But I'm going to check it anyway. Just remember, if you slide this back, don't slide any further past this flat surface right here. Or if you do, those keys will pop out. And then you got to start all over again. The next part to go on is the bearing. And I'm going to go in the house for a while. I'm going to wrap this bearing in tissue paper, stick it in my front pocket, let it warm up, and until at least I get it to like my body temperature, 100 degrees all close, and then I'll press it on there. One thing I forgot to mention is before you put the slider on, which is this thing with the reverse gear cut on it, make sure you measure the thickness right here. Should be about 0.195 or thereabouts. If it's quite a bit thicker than that, it's the different. This is for aluminum shift forks, and if it's thicker than that, like say this one right here, which is about 0.245 thick. The thicker ones are for steel shift forks. And the thinner one, about 0.195, is for aluminum shift forks. And the aluminum shift fork for this 3rd, 4th gear slider is usually found on the 87 and 88 models. Okay, I warmed up the bearing, keep it in my pocket for an hour or so, and use this drift punch. I just kind of tapped around, gently tapped it and tapped it and tapped it, going around and around until it bottomed out. Next step is to put this C-clip on. Slide it down over the end without distorting it too much. I like to tighten up these C-clips a little bit by squishing them so that they have a real snug fit when they go on. Because when you take them off, they kind of expand a little bit and they don't really come back to the normal shape. So I squish them down just a little bit before I put them on. Okay, I used this tool for the C-clip. Very carefully slid it over the top of that thing so I didn't expand any more than I had to. By the way, that C-clip was 0.083 thick. C-clip that goes over next is 0.09 thick. Again, I squished it down a little bit with the channel lock pliers, tighten it up, slide over without expanding it any more than I have to, so it's tight. Next thing to go on is 5th gear. And I heated this up so it's about just a little too hot to touch. Set it on there and wrap it down on there. Next thing to go on is the snap ring, and I use the channel lock pliers to squish it down so it's going to fit on there real snug. Oh yeah, I forgot to mention that it's .091 thick on this car. Okay, it's snapped on there. Feels real snug. Now I just have to put the sleeve on, which is this thing here. And that side goes down. I'm going to heat it up first and then knock it down on there. So I warmed it up and then I just knocked it on there with the rubber mallet till it looks like it go on there a little further. A little bit of gap between the snap ring and the end of it, so I'll knock it a little further. A couple of hits with a copper mallet knocked it right down, so it's sitting right on top of the snap ring. So that concludes putting at least the top half of this together. Third, fourth gear, new synchros. Here's the second gear. I oiled up the shaft where this sits, where I stuck this, and oiled up the inside of it. The next thing it'll go on is the Syncro. It's the Syncro. This is the hub, and there's see there's that C-ring in there to hold the detents out, and the thickness of that is .059, I think it was. Yep, .059. You want to get that in there first, lined up like that. And the big protrusion versus a small protrusion. The big protrusion goes on like that. What I'm going to do is heat this up so it's just about too hot to touch, and then I've had pretty good luck with them just sliding right on, right over. I don't even have to press them in or anything. We'll see what happens. Okay, I heated it up and slid it, and it slid right over there. Like I say, it's just too little. Right at the point where it's just too hot to touch, not any hotter. And just remember, before you slide down, you got to make sure that that snap ring is in there. One that looks like that. It's got to be inside this thing on that side of it. This one's going to go on this side. Where you can see the slot. And the Syncro lines up with the slot on the hub. Okay, the next thing that goes on is I'm gonna put this in, and it have to be installed in a certain way. If the spring that's already in there, if the end is here and the end is here, then you need to put it in like that so the ends are down, so they're opposing each other, so there's no gap in there. Okay, I'm checking to see. That's the end. See, there's the end of it right there. So I'll know that I have an end here and an end here. So my end on my other one's going to be down here and here. Put that back in there. Now I can put this one on. I'll know I have to do it like that. That'll cover this gap in here that's the other C-clip has. There's a gap because there's an end here and an end over here, so this is going to overlap the end. Okay, I've got that C-clip installed, and see the end there and an end up here. And the end of the other one is here and here, so it overlaps this area. Okay, we need to get this slider on there. You see there's just a little bit of bevel on the corner there, on the top corner. That goes aft. So basically the flat side here will go forward. I have to get the shift keys in there, greased up, and work this over it. These are the shift key that goes in there. Has the number 51 stamped on the back. There'll be 3 of them that go in there. Okay, I put the shift keys in with a little grease to hold them in place. Over here I marked the Syncro in blue where the slots are, so I make sure I line those up right. And the slider. So I also marked the slider so I can line up with the Synchros properly. So those blue marks. Okay, you can see I wrestled the thing on. Okay, the next thing that goes in is this 0.19 diameter bearing. Drops right in that little hole there. Now we can slide first gear on. Okay, now we're going to put this assembly on. There's a little bump in there. It's got to line up on that ball bearing. There. And then you got to make sure that the Syncro slot lines up with the detent. Syncro shouldn't spin. The gear should spin, but not the Syncro. Should hang up a little bit on those detents. Now we have to put the snap ring in that goes there. This is the C-clip that goes on there, and I reshaped it, channel lock, squished it until I got it down to ID of less than 1.035, because that's what the shaft is at that point. And the thickness of this one is 0.09. Okay, that's done. They say you're supposed to use a C-clip that's the thickest possible to keep the movement to a minimum. But that ball bearing is stopping this from going down any further, so even if I wanted to tighten this thing up, it really wouldn't do much good. But the snap clip is snug, so that's good. The thing I noticed, see a little bit of difference there, that 5th gear. Notice that there's like a washer in there, or maybe it's part of the 5th gear itself. It's a different 5th gear. This is off of the 83 or so. And you look at this one here, and there's just the snap. There's not even a snap ring in there. It stops at the shaft, and there's no spacer in there. There's a snap ring on the bearing, so it looks like the other one doesn't have a snap ring on the bearing. 5th gear holds it in place.